Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Constangy's webinar, Navigating the Future of Intercollegiate Athletics, Implications of the Dartmouth College Student-Athlete Labor Decision. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please submit them through the chat function. You can access the chat through the toolbar located at the bottom of your screen. Our presenters will leave time to answer your questions. This program is approved for Sherman HRCI credit. We will be sending the codes to you at the end of this presentation through the chat, so please stick around in order to get those. Lastly, we will be providing a recording of today's webinar. This will be sent to you once the recording has been uploaded by tomorrow morning. I'm now going to turn it over to today's moderator, Chris.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me. My name is Chris Deubert. I'm from the law firm of Constangy, Brooks, Smith & Profit, a national labor and employment firm. And today we're going to be discussing labor and employment issues in intercollegiate athletics with particular focus on the ongoing Dartmouth men's basketball case. With me today, hopefully rejoining, is Dean Kpere-Daibo, partner in our St. Louis office. And then Jill Bodensteiner, who is the athletic director at St. Joseph's University, has been there for almost 6 years after a 20-year stint at Notre Dame. And Jill started her career as a labor and employment attorney, both in private practice and at Notre Dame. And then we have Ian McCaw, athletic director at Liberty University, who has been in intercollegiate athletics, I think, for about 35 years at various institutions, at least on the eastern half of the country, including a 14-year stint at Baylor University. And so I will say at the outset that Constangy, this is not the most neutral or unbiased forum, obviously. And Constangy, we represent the NCAA in the Johnson v. NCAA case, which alleges that student athletes should be considered employees for purposes of federal and state wage and hour laws, which is currently on appeal to the Third Circuit, and we've represented the NCAA in similar matters prior to that. So there's a variety of cases ongoing against the NCAA, both from an antitrust and labor and employment perspective. Our focus today will try to stay in the labor and employment realm. I'll mention, in addition to the Johnson case, there is another National Labor Relations Board proceeding going on in California, where the National Labor Relations Board, the regional office there, has alleged that USC, a private school, the Pac-12, the NCAA, have violated the National Labor Relations Act by misclassifying student athletes as student athletes rather than employees. And there's been a hearing in front of an administrative law judge there that's been going on for several months. And that case at its core addresses very much the same issue that was at hand in the Dartmouth men's basketball case. So just to go backward a little bit, in the fall, the Service Employees International Union, which represents a variety of employees on Dartmouth's campus, filed a petition with the regional office of the NLRB to represent Dartmouth men's basketball players as a union. And so the threshold question in the case was whether the men's basketball players were employees for purposes of the National Labor Relations Act, and therefore were entitled to bargain collectively with the university over the terms and conditions of their employment. About a couple weeks ago, the regional office, after a hearing in the fall, issued about a 22-page ruling that said that she did believe that the men's basketball players were employees for purposes of the act, and certified them to hold a union vote, which they held yesterday. And the men's basketball team voted 13-2 to unionize. And Dean has joined us at just the right time. Dean, I'm just quickly summarizing the Dartmouth situation. So also yesterday, Dartmouth filed its appeal to, so to speak, and I'll let Dean speak to this more, with the NLRB. And so, Dean, with the background that I just I framed as to the facts, and maybe you can explain some of the legal underpinnings of the case, and then explain what the legal processes may be moving forward.
Right. So in this type of situation, I think currently as you said, the board or the Dartmouth has filed a request for review of the regional director's decision. And what that really means is that they're asking the board to make a decision or look at the facts, and look at the case law that was cited by the regional director, specifically related to their citation, or well, I guess some would say lack of citation and reliance on Columbia University, which is a well-known case, and the standard used there. Also looking at their most recent March 2023 decision that the regional director actually issued related to graduate fellows, that Dartmouth thought was relevant to their case. They thought it was kind of on all fours, right? Because in that case, you had graduate fellows who were trying to be unionized, and the regional director, this exact same regional director, indicated that because there was no compensation associated with their work, right? Their work as a graduate fellow wasn't connected to a scholarship. They didn't receive compensation for their work, and so therefore they weren't employees under the act. And so Dartmouth believed that that case was controlling all fours to their case with their basketball players, because of course their argument was that while these individuals play basketball, they didn't receive a basketball scholarship for compensation in connection with their basketball activities. And they said, listen, the equipment, the shoes, the things that they needed to play basketball weren't in lieu of playing basketball. They were given those items in order to play basketball, right? And so that's kind of where the arguments, I think, are probably going to fall. I think also the issue that Dartmouth made made it in there. If you read their brief, they made it a good point, which is under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is of course a different act, but under the Fair Standards Act, the Seventh Circuit has said on the burger that student athletes are not employees, right? And so they're saying, hey, you need to take these type of decisions into consideration, and they're asking the board to review that decision. And so now that the student athletes have voted, this request for review has been filed. The board will likely review the record, the facts that are in the record, look at the law. They'll also look at this Northwestern decision that was cited by Dartmouth, as in that decision, the NLRB didn't take jurisdiction over the football players, primarily because they believe that for what they call labor prosperity, that they typically they would go after, they would actually organize the entire league instead of just one individual team. And that was part of the analysis in Northwestern. And so the board's going to have to take a look at that and look at all of the arguments that are being presented by Dartmouth at this moment. And then, legally, ultimately from there, if the board rules against Dartmouth, I think the reality of it is they've got a decision to make from a legal perspective, because they can't go directly to the Court of Appeals with this decision, unfortunately for them, right? They've kind of have to go back down without explaining all of the nuances. They have to kind of go back down and then to come back up to get to the Court of Appeals. And so it's a long and strenuous, tenuous legal fight to appeal this all the way up to the Court of Appeals. And so it can be expensive, and it can be really tiresome for any employer that wants to get their decision in front of the Court of Appeals. And so it's called a technical 885. And so that can be a very, very tough thing to do. But that's kind of where I think this might be going, pursuant to the fact that they have filed a request for review at this point.
So let's try. I want to try and be more clear on the details there. So Dartmouth actually finished its basketball season yesterday. They finished last in the Ivy League. They have not historically been very good. So the issues are maybe a little moot for a couple months, I suppose. But the Northwestern case, the NLRB took 16 months, I believe, to ultimately issue a decision in that case. Certainly 16 months will extend into the next basketball season. So what are Dartmouth's options right now? What if this union sends a letter to Dartmouth next week saying, hey, these are our demands for collective bargaining?
Well, it depends on what Dartmouth wants to do, right? I mean, sometimes this becomes, unfortunately, it's political. Sometimes become political, and sometimes it becomes about what you want your image to be. If they really believe in their mission or believe in that these student athletes aren't employees. And in that type of situation, what is called a technical 885, and what you would do is you would refuse to bargain with the union intentionally. You would say, I'm not going to bargain with you because we believe that the regional director and the National Labor Relations Board got it wrong. And they would file an unfair labor practice charge against you for failure to bargain, right? And then you would actually litigate that issue all the way back up to the board, who likely you're going to lose, right? Because if the board has already ruled against you once, the likelihood of them changing their opinion potentially is unlikely. But your point is your goal was to get up to the Court of Appeals, right? Because you can't take an RC case directly to the Court of Appeals. And so you would take that technical 885 all the way back up to the Court of Appeals, and you want the circuit to make a decision on whether these individuals are in fact employees under the Act.
So let me try and be even more precise about it. So the NLRB is an administrative agency, but also something of a political body. It's a five members. Currently, there's only 4 people on the board: 3 Democrats, 1 Republican. I think the thought is the board will probably be sympathetic to the players' unionization efforts here, and
Right.
so we're talking about sort of 2 different proceedings happening. Would they be consolidated, or is only one part of them, the unfair labor practice charge, the one that is appealable to the Court of Appeals?
So in this situation, what you would do is you would actually get up to the Court of Appeals, or excuse me, you would get up to the board in this RC case, which is the request for review. And the board has to deny your request, right? They have to say, hey, we think that there was no, nothing went, the regional director got it right. There was nothing that happened there, or based on the facts and based on the law, we don't believe that anything was done improperly. And then you're going to get it functionally, because they won, the union won the election, you're going to likely get a request to bargain at some point, right? They're going to say, hey, go and bargain with the union. In order to kind of start this legal process and this legal fight over again, the Dartmouth is going to want to potentially, right? We don't know if this is actually their strategy, but they're going to want to get this up to the Court of Appeals. In order to do that, they're going to refuse to bargain with the union about this issue with these employees because, right, they believe that the regional director and the National Labor Relations Board got it wrong. And they want a Court of Appeals to hear the facts, review the case law, and make a decision.
Okay, so does the Dartmouth men's basketball team have to hold off on negotiation efforts until this review is decided?
Yeah, I mean, so you're refusing to bargain, so there's no process, right? So if you're refusing to bargain with the union and they say, hey, give us dates to bargain, and you say, no, I'm not giving you dates because we have no intention of bargaining with you, nothing happens, right? You got to come to the table, and in order for the union to get anything from you, the employer has to come to the table, right? And so if you're refusing to bargain because your plan is to kind of fight this back up to the court of, back up through the legal chain and finally get to the Court of Appeals, functionally bargaining is on hold until the Court of Appeals rules on this decision.
Okay. All right. So with that legal background, I'll start with Jill, your opinion, reaction to the Dartmouth ruling.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me. And I want to, from a threshold perspective, say I know the NCAA and its member institutions are working hard to make changes in a variety of ways, and I'm a firm believer that we need to continue to make changes. I'm also a firm believer that I don't think unionization of college athletes is the way to effectuate change. So Dean made these comments about the Northwestern case. So this one, obviously with the Ivy League being all private institutions, that cleared up the Northwestern being the only private in the Big Ten. But this is really unique because I think when you look at Division I, just taking Division I men's basketball, there aren't many non-scholarship teams. Again, the Northwestern case held that only the scholarship football athletes were employees. And here we're talking about non-scholarship, non-athletic scholarship, at least, student athletes. So that was very interesting and unique. And Dartmouth, among many other Ivies, when you look at NCAA rules, they provide probably the best protection on academics of any Division school out there or league out there. I mean, so they don't really have summer access. So for those who aren't as familiar with NCAA rules, we now get I think it's 8 weeks or 10 weeks. So that affection, basically functionally means that both our men's and women's basketball programs are on campus for one or more of our summer sessions, and the Ivy League doesn't do that. They're able to miss lab or miss practice for labs and other sort of things. So from that perspective, when you look at the two key factors, number one being work performed in exchange for compensation, we didn't have the athletic scholarship here. So the regional director had to expand her view of compensation into all the, benefits that the athletes receive. And again, when it comes to control, I would argue that the Ivy League, has fewer of the indicia of control than many others. So very interesting for several reasons, and I'm sure we'll get into many more of those.
Ian, your reaction and thoughts to the Dartmouth case. Were you surprised, scared, horrified, or not surprised?
Thanks, Chris. Maybe all the above. I appreciate having me on, and certainly a very timely webinar that you're hosting today. So grateful to be a part of it. In tracking some of the other cases, the Northwestern case, the USC case, as well as this one, I wasn't necessarily surprised by the NLRB decision, nor was I surprised by the vote yesterday to unionize. I don't think either of those were real surprises. I think the question is, where do we go from here? And just because a basketball team votes to unionize, how would collective bargaining work in a college athletics student athlete environment? I think is a really big question. Just practically thinking about it, I would have a hard time imagining, one team on my campus, for example, being unionized and all the other teams not being unionized. I think that bifurcation would be very problematic to have a special status for one team and not the others. I think it'd be very difficult culturally, very difficult from a management standpoint. We certainly work hard to make sure that our student athletes have all the resources they need to have the best possible experience, and be hard to, again, have to negotiate that with one group, whereas you're seeking to provide it to another. So I'm very eager to see where we go from here.
So, Dean, maybe you can help us here, which is the NCAA has over 1,100 member institutions across 3 divisions. There are private, public schools. There are religious schools like both Liberty and St. Joseph's. Which in the immediate, which ones are we talking about, and how might that expand outward?
Right. So this type of decision really only impacts the private schools, right? Because the NLRA does not apply to state school or state school. So, for a guy like myself, I'm a University of Missouri alum, and that's my team. The University of Missouri doesn't have to really worry about this decision per se right now, right? Because the state law in Missouri is different, and so and it applies to the state school. The NLRA does not apply to state institutions, and so you're talking about the private schools. So I think Ian kind of mentioned USC. He mentioned schools like Notre Dame. The private schools are the ones this is really going to have an impact on. And for right now, this decision, the real crux of it is, and I think Jill made a great point. Dartmouth probably does the best of not controlling these athletes. They do the best of trying to make sure that academics comes first before the sport, right? And if we're going to, and if the NLRB is going to interpret the act to apply to student athletes the way they are in this decision, at a la, if you have a student handbook, that's the equivalent of an employee handbook in control. If you're asking players to schedule their classes around practice, that's going to be a problem for a lot of universities, right? And then ultimately, the concept that Dartmouth didn't provide scholarships for basketball; they only provided scholarships for students for their academics. However, the comp that they looked at was the fact that they received basketball shoes, they received equipment, that they received sweatshirts, t-shirts, and at the end of the day, access to alumni, which could, I guess, be a benefit to them later on down the road. If that's all you need for comp, then most private institutions, D1 institutions, are gonna be concerned about this decision, and they should be.
So, Jill, you feel free to add to that, but I am curious of the tenor you feel around student athletes in your own experience. Do you anticipate? Are you hearing rumblings of more unionization efforts? How do you feel the student athletes on your campuses are feeling about these issues? I'm sure they see the news. What do you anticipate? You know, like one question is sort of what's the timeline? Are we going to see a bunch of unionization efforts in the next 6 months, or might it be a much longer timeline, you think, as the case plays out?
Yeah, Chris, I'll get to answer your question, but I first want to note, you know, we talked about publics versus privates, but one of the concerns I have just about the NLRA and the process is it is a little more politicized than, you know, it's a board that tends to ebb and flow depending on who's in the White House. And so right now, I think under the Bethany College decision of 2020, religiously affiliated institutions of higher education are not subject to jurisdiction of the NLRA. So let's just look at the Atlantic 10. There are 15 institutions in our conference, the Atlantic 10. And if Bethany still prevails, 8 of us are religiously affiliated. That leaves 7, most of whom are public. So that leaves 2 out of 15 schools in the Atlantic 10 that could be under current interpretations and NLRB decisions could be subject to unionization. And this goes to the notion that, you know, what's different about teaching assistants and graduate students and even undergraduate student dining hall workers is we're in a competitive industry. And obviously that's what the Northwestern NLRB said is for public policy reasons, it's difficult to compete. So, you know, you think about things like hiring and retaining coaches in a world where there's a handful of unionized environments and many more that are not. So, so that's one of my biggest concerns on whether this is the answer to give college athletes more of a voice is just the unevenness of it, both under current rulings and future rulings. As for on my campus, I'm really transparent with our student athletes. I've been down to the Hill. I think upcoming Tuesday will be my 4th visit, and I take a student athlete or more with me every time. I want them to understand the process. I want them to understand the issues. They're very concerned about employee status for multiple reasons. You know, one of which we have 51 international student athletes on our campus. I think, you know, we've been waiting for 2 years for the federal government to give us some guidance on how NIL applies to them and have received none. So I think we are very anxious about their status. I mean, question, you know, for you guys under the regional director's decision in Dartmouth, can those athletes continue to practice, or does it violate their F1 student visa status? Is that considered work now that they're employees under the NLRA? And if it's work, I'm not sure it fits into OPT or whatever the limited exceptions for work. So I think that they have several concerns. They're worried about what that would mean toward sports sponsorship at various institutions. You know, if we're having to create an infrastructure that allows us to bargain, is that going to impact the number of sports we sponsor, so on and so forth. So I think they're concerned. I do not feel on our campus any wave or push, but they want to be informed, and I'm happy to inform them. And ultimately, it's their decision to make. Although Bethany College is right now a large barrier to their ability to do so.
Right. So, Ian, I mean, your football team has been pretty good the last couple of years. You're competing in a competitive conference in part of the country that really likes football. So I imagine your student athletes are very interested in these issues.
You know, we've had some discussion with our student athlete advisory committee on this topic, and similar to what Jill shared, we have a good number of international student athletes, not in football, but in other sports. And, you know, there's certainly questions from them as to what their status would be in an employment model. And I think that's creates some uncertainty. What I do hear more from our student athletes and really student athletes in some of our conferences is, you know, if there is a movement to compensate, pay employees in sports like football and basketball, is that going to result in the elimination of some Olympic sports? And that's a fair question, and I think a reasonable concern.
Is that a question you've heard from Olympic sport athletes? Just kind of wondering.
Yes, yeah, from Olympic sport athletes. And then, as far as any type of movement on our campus along the lines of what's happened at Dartmouth or Northwestern, we haven't had anything along those lines.
Okay. Dean, I want to talk about, we've talked about a little bit this issue of scholarships and compensation, and Dartmouth, as you've sort of touched on it, for a variety of reasons, is a very interesting test case here, so to speak, because of the nature of the Ivy League, and there's no scholarships, and the lessened level of control. And in reading their brief last night, they distinguished themselves quite a bit from, and intentionally so, from, say, some of the Power 5 schools. And I wonder if in some senses, for their own benefit, they're drawing a line in the sand that may not benefit the NCAA from a larger perspective, in terms of, hey, we're non-scholarship, but hey, everyone who is scholarship, maybe that would reasonably be considered compensation. And maybe just talk a little bit more about the role of this scholar, like that seems a point that the Dartmouth players are most vulnerable on appeal. The idea that sneakers and shoes and the early admission, quote unquote, like that's compensation sufficient to be considered an employee. So maybe talk about how that may shake out a little bit.
Right. I think that, Dartmouth, rightfully so, made it a point that, I think that these folks aren't on an academic or on a athletic scholarship. And so as a result, they really aren't getting any compensation. And I really do think to your point, Chris, that, as this goes up the legal chain, and I think that the argument that these individuals receive clothing, shoes, equipment, that's enough, or that's the type of compensation that should make someone officially an employee, I think is a tenuous argument, in my opinion. I'll just give you an example. I wasn't an athlete in college, but I was a musician in college. And I sang in a choir, and we had practices, and we arranged our schedules around those practices. And we were given equipment, we were given clothing for our choir. And oh, by the way, we showed up to alumni events and shook people's hands, and we sang for our alumni. I don't see much of a distinction from what they just said about these basketball players there, right? So was I an employee? Right? Like, I know that at the University of Missouri, they're a state, but if, take the analysis, right? Similar, I'm sure there are similar students and student groups on campuses like Dartmouth and other Ivy League schools where they are involved in an activity that actually benefits the university and also benefits them. And if you give them equipment, clothing, they practice and they work around those practices, are those people employees too? I think that would be, I think the focus has been, and when I read the union's brief, and I think we see this throughout, not just with the NLRB, but with the briefs from other cases like Berger and Johnson and other cases where they're trying to make student athletes into employees. The focus is always, at the end of the day, they're saying, hey, you guys make money off these people, so therefore they're employees. I think that really comes down, that's the argument, right?
Right.
And I don't think that that's the end of the analysis. And I think for specifically Dartmouth and the way they've structured their student athletes, I think a court is going to look hard and long at this analysis of what type of compensation that they say is compensation, that the board says is compensation. And I think they're probably not going to quite agree with that clothing and shoes are because they were the comp for them to play basketball instead of, well, they're playing basketball, so we provide them the equipment in order to play basketball, which is a distinction.
Right.
And Dean, it's interesting because imagine if Dartmouth were to sit down and bargain and you say, okay, what are our subjects of bargaining?
Right.
We've already established that shoes are your compensation. So would you like another pair? Like, I hate to be snarky, but it's like the regional director just set the definition of compensation, in my opinion, quite low. So now we're
Right.
negotiating over the benefits they're already receiving, which are shoes and apparel and travel. And
Right.
I think we'd all be happy to negotiate on those things where we treat our athletes, you know, as has been well reported, unfortunately, better than WNBA athletes.
Right.
And so it's just an interesting twist on that being compensation. I think that then becomes your baseline for bargaining.
Right.
And so I think, Jill, I was going to say you're identifying an interesting distinction, which is, again, the NLRA is different from wage and hour statute. So if this is your compensation, it doesn't necessarily mean you're entitled to a state or federal minimum wage. Go ahead, Dean.
Right. Right. Well, and the other thing too, you think about it, Jill, you have a great point, just practically. In bargaining, that doesn't mean just because that's what we provide today, doesn't mean that's what we provide at the end of the bargain, right? So like for a school that maybe is losing money on the deal, and there's like, hey, like maybe we don't provide you guys Jordans because that's what we've been providing you, and those are $200 a piece. Maybe instead we're going to give you some cheaper Adidas because that's just cheaper. And maybe we go get it, you know, whatever. Those things that really has become kind of the framework for, as Jill said, for this type of bargaining, right? Instead of giving you 2 hoodies, we're going to give you 1, because you know what? At the end of the day, it's kind of, you know, it's kind of expensive to provide you guys all this equipment and all this clothing. Maybe instead of chartering a jet, maybe we fly commercial because it's cheaper for us to do it that way, right? Like, you know, everything isn't all, you don't always get more in bargaining, right? Like sometimes you get less, and maybe you have to give up something to get something, and that's the way bargaining works. And so I'm not sure people are explaining that to some of these student athletes either. I also think it's also important to understand that we're dealing with the SEIUs. I mean, I don't call them the janitors union, but they started off functionally as a janitors union. Do they have the necessary resources or understand athletes and understand what they should be bargaining for these athletes? That's also something that folks should be thinking about, right? This is new for everyone. It's not just new for the university. It might also be new for the union, because they don't have a history of bargaining on behalf of athletes. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So Ian, I'm going to lean on your experience here. I mean, I think sometimes people talk about the NCAA as a single entity, as if Charlie Baker could just issue an edict and suddenly something's going to change. And Jill, you referenced, you know, that there are evolutions happening, changes happening, but maybe speak in your mind of how difficult it is for the NCAA to change policy and issues, and how long that might take, and might the courts sort of get there before the membership does?
You know, first of all, I've been thoroughly impressed with President Baker. I think he's doing a terrific job, and he has entered the fray at a very challenging time in college athletics, and is handling a multitude of issues. And this is one of them. And he has spent a lot of time going out and speaking to administrators and coaches and student athletes to gather feedback. And I know one of the themes that he has picked up along the way is that student athletes do not want to be employees. And he's shared that with many groups. But at the same time, I think he's also finding ways to provide a better overall experience for student athletes in a non-employment model, whereby there is some additional compensation beyond a scholarship, beyond the academic incentive, beyond the cost of attendance, and beyond NIL, which is currently in place. And there's been some discussion about revenue sharing at the highest level, perhaps the SEC and the Big Ten. There may be, because those are very affluent conferences, there may be some type of revenue sharing that could be created. He's talked about a new subdivision, which I think would align potentially with those best resourced conferences. So I think he's very much working on behalf of student athletes to try to create a non-employment model that affords student athletes, at least in revenue producing sports, more benefits. So
when President Baker announced that possibility of the sort of supra Division I, so to speak, where there'd be $30,000, I believe, in an NIL money in a trust, and it seemed to reportedly catch some members by surprise. And I'm wondering, and Jill, you can speak to this too, to the degree to which this is a large membership to the degree to which there's going to continue to be consistency in terms of legal position? Or might some schools raise their hand and say, you know what, we are going to start paying our players and challenge the NCAA?
Yeah, again, I think the concept that President Baker floated, and again, I think he threw the $30,000 figure out there to get the conversation started as a concept, not as a specific outcome. But again, I think that the belief is that just given the vast resource that's available, again, specifically for the Big Ten, the SEC, because of their television contracts, that they're in a different position than the rest of Division I or the rest of the membership. And as a result of that, certainly they have the capacity, which many of us would not, to provide some additional compensation beyond the traditional ones that I mentioned earlier. So again, I think he's trying to find a way to meet in the middle and better support student athletes, but not do it to the detriment of Olympic sports being eliminated and really a completely different collegiate model.
So Jill, maybe elaborate on your points earlier about the changes that are being considered and how long you think that might take. And again, I'm curious where you think the schools will continue to sort of move or have the same legal position, so to speak.
Yeah, first, I couldn't agree more, Ian, in the great summary of Charlie Baker and his efforts. I am fully on board and really impressed with what he has been doing on behalf of this membership association. Arguably, you're already seeing some early signs of breakaways with schools and attorney generals suing the NCAA for injunctions, and the NCAA pausing its enforcement of some of its rules because of those legal actions. So yeah, I think, the timing, it's really hard when you have 360 Division I institutions with very different approaches, interests, sizes, budgets, reasons for sponsoring Division I sports. Those vary so widely among our membership that it's tough. I am feeling and sensing a growing understanding that we need to continue to evaluate and put really everything on the table. And I think that we're starting to see some more tangible thoughts and proposals. So, I think it's become really clear that the options are have the courts hand us our new reality, or continue, as President Baker has been doing, is creating our own reality.
I'm just curious, you can just speak specifically or generally where you think colleges are, to the degree to which they are beginning to do financial modeling and or a self-reflection of where they want to be in, say, 3, 5, 10 years in terms of student athletes. What would it look like to cost from a cost structure, and how might that change their mission? Do you think that's the process colleges are starting?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I did a podcast last week. I know we've begun it in earnest through our board and our president's cabinet and my leadership team and student athlete input. I did a podcast last week where I talked about, a couple key issues I was asked about key issues for presidents and boards right now. It's to go back and thoroughly understand why you sponsor Division I sports, because the assumptions that we used to make have changed. And that's not just in athletics, that's higher education, right? Enrollment, all of the challenges in higher education enrollment are, changing our view as discount rates at a lot of schools continue to rise. You have to look at everything differently. You've got to look at, the fact that, does athletics aid still make sense if you can stack aid with university aid, and that university aid has changed. And you've got some states with free community college and some states with free four-year college for people in certain income brackets. So there's so many changes to higher education as a whole that it's really time to, I think, start with that fundamental question of why are we sponsoring this Division I sports, and what will it look like if we want to continue to do so?
Ian, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see different subdivisions within Division I come up with their own analysis, and I know there's a one AAA group that is very interested in maintaining more of a traditional college model. They're not in position necessarily to enter the NIL sweepstakes and revenue sharing and those types of endeavors. but they very much value the benefits that college athletics provides in their campus. They want to provide a great experience for their student athletes, but they know they can't compete at the very highest level. So I think I think Jill's point's a very good one, really evaluating what truly is the mission of your athletic program. What are you trying to accomplish with it? And I think that's going to maybe, again, as we look at the subdivisions, there may be opportunities to further subdivide our 360 Division I members, where the group at the highest level can achieve their goals, and groups at various other levels can run programs that are consistent with their goals and expectations.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was just going to, anyone, please feel free to add questions into the chat, and I'll try and incorporate them in as we go here. But I think, some of the discussions maybe are talking about sort of deprofessionalizing or removing some of the issues that come up in the Dartmouth case. And certainly we've referenced sort of the money and how things have changed over the last 30 to 40 years with television revenue, increased coaching salaries, and the facilities that exist these days. Do you anticipate, or could you see a world in which, okay, coaches are going to be paid a little less at maybe the mid-tier schools, like maybe St. Joe's and other A10 or Liberty, which are sort of just below sort of the Power Five, and also maybe less investment in facilities over time? And how might, I guess people would say, why don't you just take that money and pay the student athletes, and have just a changed economic arrangement? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot packed into there, Chris, but I'll start with, I'm working on that subcommittee that Ian referenced of the D1 AAA, and it really is about looking at this as a continuum of control and primary beneficiary. I mean, if you take our, we have men's rowing, for example, which is not an NCAA recognized sport, but we treat it as a varsity sport. And if you put that in the control and primary beneficiary test, I think it's really clear that those individuals are not employees. And so, what does that continuum look like? Do we even know some of the rules our coaches have? And so, one thing I'm encouraging athletic directors to collect your team by team handbooks and collect your team rules. Are people still saying what athletes can post on social media? If so, that's probably passe. Like, that's probably something that we ought to take a look at, unless it's university policy, right? Ian and I are both at religiously affiliated institutions, and perhaps there's guidance that we give to all students. So I do think that's an important aspect of this. But yeah, I think some of the key questions we're talking about now, I mean, I've got $45 million athletic facility underway, with improvements there too. And, we've talked about, should that change? Should we, should anything that's happening in the landscape of college athletics change what we're doing with that project? Available more to all students, available to, I mean, just really looking at the usage of that building and what it's going to look like. And I'd say the second biggest campus conversation is about development and fundraising. And, how are we, preparing? We're all in a world now where NIL collectives are competing for dollars from our fans and donors. Many of those are not tax exempt. And so is that sustainable? Are we going to be able to sustain our collective for the basketballs at $1 million+ annually? And if so, what does that look like? What happens if, as President Baker suggested in his proposal, under some, either voluntarily or not, what if we are paying direct NIL to student athletes? What will that look like? I mean, there's a limit. I don't know about Ian, but I have a limited pile of money. And so it's just making decisions on what's best for the student athletes and what's best for the university as a way to allocate our resources.
So Ian, you've been involved in college football coach bidding wars, so I'm kind of curious how you think these changes may affect that landscape.
Yeah, on the coaches' salaries at the highest level, the coaches' salaries are going to continue to escalate because those institutions, the price of not winning is much greater than the amount that they're going to pay to get the very best coach they can hire. So I think at the top of the market, you're going to continue to see escalation. I think your point is a good one, that I think if we do realign Division I, and there's some different subdivisions, I do think some of the lower subdivisions might end up having lower compensation for some of the head coaching positions. I think that's a reasonable outcome. We're really just in such an interesting time right now because on one hand, college sports have never been more popular than they are right now. The television ratings, it's great to see the growth of women's sports, women's basketball in particular has really exploded. And so the popularity, the television ratings are incredible. At the same time, we probably have more challenges than we've ever had before. Dealing with donor fatigue, all the issues around NIL, collectives, again, some of the perceived entitlement of student athletes. So it's really it's a fascinating time to be working in college athletics, and every day is a new day.
So Dean, Ian just I think referenced an issue that we talked about a little bit. I think we haven't talked enough about it yet, which is Title IX, the potential implications for these changes in Title IX, which generally provides for the benefits should be equivalent, or there's some degree of equity between the male and female student athletes. Maybe provide a little bit of your perspective on how these changes may affect that issues under that law.
Yeah, well, Title IX is not going away, and I think one of the really interesting spaces that we need further guidance on is NIL, because my assumption is that the vast majority of the collectives are not allocating NIL resources anywhere close to equitably between men and women. And so, as Jill mentioned, one of the concepts out there is potentially bringing NIL in-house. That would enable universities to do so. But whether that happens and when it happens, that's something I think we're all tracking on very carefully right now.
Jill, your thoughts there?
Yeah, I agree 100% with Ian on NIL. There are a lot of interesting questions there. But take it to the labor, and let's just say that I think a very likely result at some institutions could be that the men's basketball team has a bargaining unit and the women do not. And then the question is, I think I'm correct that Title IX does not, a collective bargaining agreement does not excuse you from Title IX responsibilities. And so then are you, whatever the men bargain for, are you giving to the women with or without a union? And then do they get the value of those benefits without the union dues and without the trouble of maintaining a bargaining unit? So I think those are interesting issues as well. And if football, I'm less conversant in football right now. I'm at a non-football institution, but if football is the only bargaining unit, let's say at a private institution, and they negotiate certain benefits, how does, again, if a collective bargaining agreement does not waive Title IX obligations, I think that could have significant impact. And that goes to, when I talk about cutting or eliminating sports, it's not from a union animus, it's from an economic realities perspective, which is there's only so much. And I think Ian's right. I think some coaching salaries at some institutions would go down to help cover. But at some point, even creating an infrastructure, what if Ian and I don't know how many sports you had, but what if I did have 21 bargaining units? The number of personnel that would take to keep those bargaining units and collective bargaining agreements and, Weingarten rights and all of the implementation of that would be extraordinarily taxing on a small institution of higher education with a limited HR department already stretched to their capacity. So I think these are all very real considerations if unionization were to catch fire.
But Dean, two things. One, Title IX thoughts you might have, and also then the possibility of schools eliminating teams if there is a unionization drive. Maybe talk about the challenges or problems with that.
Well, I agree with Ian and Jill from a Title IX perspective. I mean, just because a group becomes unionized doesn't change or a collective bargaining agreement is in place, doesn't change their obligations on Title IX. To be honest with you, I think Jill kind of laid it out perfectly that, so I think some athletic departments are going to have, if that happens to them, they're going to have real decisions to make about where that money goes, where it comes from, how they service those contracts, and it could potentially have an impact on not just the female sports, but also male sports as well, because they're going to, because of their obligation to Title IX, right? So I think Title IX is a big question mark that we're not quite sure about. And then what was your second question, Chris?
The idea that, well, what if, say, the tennis team somewhere decides they want to unionize and a school says, you know what, we don't really need a tennis team. We're going to get rid of the tennis team now. Can they do that?
Yeah, so that would be a violation of the law, right? Because they eliminated the positions or eliminated that team who I guess the board in that particular situation would consider employees. They limited those positions because of unanimous, and that would be a violation of the act. And so they would have to adhere to that, right? So the board would likely come after them for that unfair labor practice charge, or unfair labor practice. A charge would be filed, and it would likely be investigated and litigated in front of the National Labor Relations Board, in front of potentially a hearing officer or ALJ, and then potentially up to the board if it was appealed to the board. And so that is a big legal problem. Take it away from sports, take it away from any employer who eliminates positions because those individuals want to unionize. That is a violation of the act, right? And I don't think that changes because it's a school and these are student athletes.
Ian, you referenced earlier, we were talking earlier about fan interest, or you said college sports have never been more popular. Do you anticipate, and if there came to be a time where more student athletes were considered employees, might fan interest change, or how does your alumni react to these issues?
Well, that's a great question, Chris. I think that again, college sports in this country are just incredibly popular, and it's just incredible again to see the ratings, the growth in women's sports, and just the overall popularity. But I certainly could see a time where fans just feel there's too much entitlement. They become frustrated, and we're seeing that with quite honestly, some of the professional leagues have lost some popularity just because fans are not as enthused with some of the things they're seeing. So, yeah, I think it's something that needs to be monitored. I don't have a prediction on how that's going to unfold, but I do think some of these issues relative to labor could play a factor.
Jill, you referenced earlier that you're going down to Capitol Hill next week, and you've done that a couple of times. Maybe you have some insight or thoughts on. There's now been many years of the discussions of possible legislation, but nothing's ever made out of committee concerning collegiate athletic issues. So, where do you think those things stand in terms of possibilities?
Yeah, I think most insiders on the Hill are skeptical of a comprehensive bill and the ability of Congress to get a comprehensive bill dealing with NIL and student employment and antitrust and so on and so forth. I think that's a big ask. But I think, I think we have to remain optimistic and continue to have conversations to educate and just make sure that that Congress understands whether it's NIL state law preemption or employee status under the NLRA or, the bite-size issues. I think it's really important that we continue to tell our story. I think, the general public gets a narrative that is, Power 5 football teams cash grabbing and changing conferences, and there's a narrative that's out there, and I feel really compelled to spend time on Capitol Hill because that's not the narrative at St. Joseph's University. Like, we couldn't be in a further reality in terms of why we're sponsoring college athletics. We're 80% subsidized by the university in terms of our expenses versus our revenue. So the reasons that we offer the experiences for our athletes are primarily for them. I'm sure you've all seen the statistics that 95% of women who reach the C-suite at Fortune 500 companies were athletes. Like, it's a great equalizer for women, and it's a great opportunity for our athletes to get an education outside of the classroom. And so, what we're hearing about the Pac-12 and the Big Ten and football, and it's just not our reality. So I feel compelled to let people understand there are many different stories, and it's a complex narrative.
I am curious that you're closely tied to Notre Dame, and they're obviously a very unique institution in a lot of ways. They have very high academic standards, and then tremendous football history that also stands on it by itself. And they sometimes come up in this discussion as on either side of a debate. I'm curious where you the type of moral wrangling they may be doing about the future.
I wish I had the bandwidth to worry about what my alma mater is doing right now, but honestly, good luck. I've got to worry about myself, and they're a religiously affiliated institution as well from a unionization perspective. So, that's certainly one factor, but I think the conversations I have had, it is difficult when you're trying to be, one of those schools that holds themselves out as a very high academic institution, even for its student athletes. And I can attest to the fact that there are, no majors, nowhere to hide for Notre Dame football and other student athletes, and that it is academics first. So I wish them the best.
We have a couple of minutes left here, so if people have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. Dean, we've touched on this issue, and I'll talk about it from the legal perspective a little bit more, which is the idea of one employer with within a conference or a multi-employer bargaining unit potentially, and how the NLRB might view that on this sort of appeal. The idea that only Dartmouth may be an employer within a larger conference or group of employers.
Got it. So I think that with respect to Dartmouth and that issue, so you're referring to the Northwestern decision and kind of the jurisdictional issue, right? I mean, I think that the board is going to have to take a look at that, right? Because in the decision, the regional director said it wasn't applicable, right? Because they're, basically Dartmouth is in the Ivy and they're all the same. There's no issue with the kind of like Northwestern, or unlike a Northwestern where they were the only private school in the Big Ten, and the NLRB's preference is to kind of not go after that single employer. But in this situation, you're looking at Dartmouth, which is one of the Ivies, and they're all the same, right? I think the rules are all pretty much similar in the effect that they aren't providing scholarships based on athletics, and a lot of their rules and academics is pushed forward first. And so, I think that the board is probably going to make some type of, they're going to make find a way to say that this is different than Northwestern, right? And I think that you saw that with this decision. And to be honest with you, if you look at the agenda that the current general counsel is taking with just student athlete status in general, and thus far, she's gotten a lot of what from the board, what she's wanted in her general counsel memos, for her agenda. I think this board will find that Dartmouth is different than Northwestern, that they won't find that this is, and they'll say they have jurisdiction over this, particularly over that issue. And so, I think that Northwestern jurisdictional argument is just not going to fly with this current board in their request for review.
On a little different angle on that, Dean,
Yeah.
If the Dartmouth decision had said the control is a result purely of NCAA or Ivy League rules, I would have thought that they were teeing up a joint employer with the league. But as I read this decision, all of the control factors were Dartmouth.
True.
Dartmouth treatment. So I thought in terms of this, I'll just leave it there. I thought factually it was pretty Dartmouth specific rather than basing the control on the Ivy League.
Right. They mentioned it, like they mentioned the NCAA rules and Kpere and all that and how that works. But you're right, they didn't rely on those controls to say that that's the control that the employer Dartmouth had over the employees. In fact, they used primarily their handbook, right? And the fact that they requested them to schedule their classes around their practices and things like that. So to your point, you're right. The other thing I'll say is, listen, I think Jill teed this earlier, but the NLRB it's a creature of politics, right? To an extent. And so whoever is in office kind of has a little bit of a control over the over the agenda to an extent, particularly as board members run out of their tenure and they get to be replaced by the new president. And so there's a chance that a lot of this movement the direction that we're going, depending on the election, could change, right? Not saying it changes immediately, but over time, this push can change differently or drastically. I think we saw that with the Trump administration, the Trump board, and where their approach was, and then Biden coming in, and the board changing significantly over the last 2 to 3 years. That now we have another election year, and that could have an impact on kind of the results of what we're seeing in this movement that we're seeing in organizing of student athletes.
So we've just about hit our end here. I'd like to give Jill and Ian the any closing thoughts. Kind of curious, are you optimistic, pessimistic, neutral, or do you want to abstain at this point?
I'm a positive person, and I'm optimistic that we're moving into a better space in college athletics. It's been a rocky road here for the last little while. I think we are going to get to some better outcomes relative to NIL and compensating student athletes, and hopefully in a manner that does not trigger employment. I do think the future of athletics is bright, but it will be different.
Jill.
Agreed. It does no good to be a pessimist. I see this as a giant puzzle, and whatever we can all do to help put a piece in it. I'm staying optimistic. Great.
Well, thank you everyone for attending. Jill and Ian, thank you very much for your time. I know you're very busy and you have to think about these issues. So thanks everyone for joining us, and have a good rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you.